On December 8, 1941, just hours before the infamous attack on Pearl Harbor, Imperial Japanese troops stepped foot on a newly hostile shore. It wasn't the US or the Philippines, but Malaya, which at that time was under the control of the British Empire. It was the start of a 2-month military campaign that would go disastrously wrong for the Allies, culminating in the fall of Singapore and the destruction of British influence in the Far East. The threat from Japan in the East had long been recognised by the British, ever since the expiry of the Anglo-Japanese alliance in 1922 and the signature of the Washington Treaty that limited the size of the Royal Navy. In 1923, the First Lord of the Admiralty, Leo Amery, told the Prime Minister of South Africa, "If there were ever a European combination against us at the same moment as war was declared against us by Japan, we should be in a position of extraordinary difficulty." To counter this, a new large naval base at Singapore was constructed, where a British battle fleet could be positioned in the event of war in Europe. It was hoped that the presence of a British fleet there would deter any Japanese aggression. But after a war in Europe did begin in 1939, the decision was taken to prioritise ships to the Mediterranean, so no battle fleet was deployed east. With no deterrent in the Far East, the British were forced into concessions to Japan to avoid war in 1940. They looked to the United States for support, hoping that its own fleet could act as a deterrent, but the US was not interested in protecting the British position in the Far East, what it fundamentally saw as British imperialism. In July 1941, Japan fully occupied Vichy French-controlled Indochina. This set alarm bells ringing in London. Suddenly, Japan had naval and air bases in southern Vietnam, putting Singapore and the Dutch East Indies at risk of short-range attack. The need for a fleet at Singapore intensified. The first Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, did not want to spare any of the Royal Navy's most modern battleships from the Atlantic, not while the German battleship Tirpitz remained at large. He therefore proposed in August 1941 that a fleet of slower, older battleships be sent east. The Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, had other ideas. He favoured a small number of the Navy's best ships being dispatched to Singapore to act like a British Bismarck, offering an elusive menace to Japanese offensive plans and tying down a disproportionate number of Japanese capital ships. There were a number of problems with this approach. The new King George V class battleships were slower than Bismarck, had only recently come into service, and would be facing much more sophisticated Japanese naval aviation than the British had deployed against Bismarck. The Admiralty made its opposition clear, arguing that it was just too soon for the brand new Prince of Wales to be deployed, but to no avail. When the Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, intervened to argue that Prince of Wales could act as a deterrent to Japan even declaring war in the first place, the decision was made. On October 25th, the Royal Navy's second newest battleship sailed for Singapore, carrying Admiral Sir Tom Phillips, newly appointed as the Commander-in-Chief of the grandly named Eastern Fleet. As the British had been agonising over Singapore, the Japanese had been preparing for war. They had been committed to expanding southwards since July 1941. In truth, the presence or absence of a couple of British battleships at Singapore was not going to change this, whether it be Prince of Wales or the older group of ships the Admiralty ended up arguing for. By November 7th, Japan had settled on December 8th with attacks on Hong Kong, the East Indies, Malaya and Burma, as well as the preemptive attack on Pearl Harbor. At the end of November, Prince of Wales rendezvoused with the battlecruiser Repulse at Ceylon. Along with a very small destroyer screen, they were to be Britain's main naval strength in the east until reinforcements could arrive in 1942. Admiral Phillips arrived in Singapore on December 2nd. Less than 24 hours later, he was signalled by the Admiralty that Japanese submarines were heading south to watch Singapore. It was becoming clear that the dispatch of 2 capital ships had done nothing to deter Japan as hoped. Not long afterwards, on December 6th, RAF air reconnaissance spotted Japanese convoys off Indochina heading south. There was immediate alarm that these were heading for Siam and Malaya. Repulse was quickly recalled from a planned cruise to Port Darwin to be ready to act. Overnight on December 8th, Singapore was attacked in a long-range bombing raid, and a few hours later Admiral Phillips was informed that Pearl Harbor had been bombed, that hostile troops were streaming ashore in northern Malaya, and that Britain was at war with the Empire of Japan. Japan's attack meant that Admiral Phillips's fleet had failed before a shot had even been fired, and the mauling of the US fleet at Pearl Harbor meant that the Allies were for now decisively outnumbered at sea. Phillips also knew that the estimates of the Japanese force off Malaya had their destroyer strength outnumbering his by 5 to 1. But regardless, the Japanese transports unloading troops had to be stopped. For Malaya to be saved, the invasion had to be halted in the north. So despite the odds, the Eastern Fleet, designated operationally as Force Z, left Singapore at 6:30 on December 8th and swung north. The big unknown for the British Admiral was Japanese air power. In the Mediterranean, no attacks from shore-based aircraft had been made more than 200 miles away from their base. It was at least 300 miles from the target area to Indochina. With the large distance and element of surprise, Phillips hoped that any aircraft over Malaya would not be expecting ships and would be equipped with high explosive bombs for attacking land targets. So, when at 1 AM on December 9th news came that no RAF fighter support from airfields in northern Malaya would be available, Prince of Wales pressed on. The morning brought cloud and mist, which helpfully shielded the British ships from the air. But by 1:40 PM, a lurking Japanese submarine spotted Force Z and quickly signalled its position and course to the Imperial Navy. The Japanese ordered a task force to intercept, and aircraft in Indochina that had already loaded for ground attack had their armament swapped out for torpedoes and armour-piercing bombs. By evening, the clouds had lifted. At 5:40, Prince of Wales spotted Japanese reconnaissance planes tracking the fleet. With the element of surprise now clearly and obviously lost, the prospect of a successful attack was slim. Admiral Phillips had no choice but to turn back to Singapore. It was 500 miles back to base for Force Z, and at 2:10 AM they were again spotted by a submarine. This gave the Japanese an up-to-date position and course, and meant that attack aircraft began taking off while it was still dark. That same night, Phillips received reports of additional Japanese landings at Kuantan and decided to take a detour to investigate, with the prospect of a surprise attack enticing the British Admiral once again. After hours of steaming west, when the sun came up, Force Z was disappointed to find Kuantan in complete peace, according to the destroyer HMS Electra. There were no additional landings. And to make matters worse, the British ships had been spotted again by Japanese aircraft. Phillips turned south, but curiously did not signal to ask for fighter cover from Singapore. A few minutes after 11, 8 Japanese bombers appeared over the horizon. Force Z's anti-air batteries launched into a barrage, with 66 guns of 4-inch caliber and higher opening up on their attackers. It was to little effect. None of the first wave was shot down, and Repulse was straddled by bombs, suffering 1 hit to her port hangar. 20 minutes later, a second wave of 9 torpedo planes followed, using patches of cloud cover to mask their approach. They darted in for attack runs in pairs or groups of 3. It was very well drilled, and the British AA failed to disrupt them. The consequences were severe. At 11:42, Prince of Wales was hit aft by 2 torpedoes in quick succession. It was an ultimately mortal injury. Her steering gear and engine rooms were smashed, putting the ship into a slow, continual turn to port, listing badly. At 12:10, the flagship signalled that she was not under control. It had taken just a single torpedo raid to cripple one of the Royal Navy's most modern battleships. Meanwhile, shortly before midday, Captain Tennant of Repulse signalled Singapore to request air cover, before manoeuvring sharply to dodge the tracks of 6 oncoming torpedoes. There was an almost constant wave of Japanese aircraft now. Another wave came in, and 8 more torpedoes were successfully sidestepped by the battlecruiser. While Repulse was practicing its torpedo beats, Prince of Wales was taking a huge amount of punishment now. By 12:26, the flagship had been hit by 4 more torpedoes, and its speed was down to 8 knots. One aircraft now finally scored a hit on Repulse, sneaking through after a dummy run towards Prince of Wales. The Japanese bombers now focused on the battlecruiser, attacking from all directions so Captain Tennant couldn't dodge them all. The AA batteries raged and the occasional hostile aircraft was shot down, but it was not nearly enough. Repulse was hit by 4 torpedoes in as many seconds and quickly took on a huge list to port. Tennant realised quickly that the ship was doomed and ordered abandon ship. At 12:33, Repulse, a 25-year-old veteran of the First World War, rolled over and sank. A short distance away, Prince of Wales was still struggling on, slowly losing its battle with the sea. At 12:50, the ship signalled for Singapore to send all available tugs, but it was far too late. At 1:20, she too capsized and sunk, only 325 days after being commissioned. Just as she slipped below the waves, 11 RAF fighters arrived over the area. They had taken off just 7 minutes after Repulse's signal had been received. It remains somewhat of a mystery why air cover hadn't been asked for earlier in the morning. It was a grim defeat for the Royal Navy. Months of prevaricating over the right combination of ships to send had ended up with 2 capital ships being sacrificed for precisely zero benefit. The only comfort was that destroyers were on hand to pick up many of the crew. From the 2 ships, 2,081 sailors had been rescued, with 837 killed. The sinking of Repulse and Prince of Wales ended any meaningful Allied naval resistance off the coast of Malaya. Japan was now free to reinforce and resupply its troops on land as they embarked on the subjugation of the peninsula. While Admiral Phillips was engaged in his ill-fated voyage to destruction, on land British decision-makers were trying to work out how they would defend the naval base, which no longer had a fleet, at Singapore. Doing so would require Malaya itself to be held. After all, if Japanese troops reached the Straits of Johor and could bring down artillery onto the naval base, then Singapore would be rendered useless regardless of whether or not it was held by ground forces. So plans were drawn up to hold Malaya against any hostile incursions. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, commanding ground forces in Malaya, estimated that he would need around 48 infantry battalions to securely hold the peninsula. But by December 1941, only around 30 battalions were available. These were split among 3 different field divisions and garrisons spread around Malaya. The British force represented a mix of troops from all across the empire. Many had only recently arrived in Malaya and had little time to train together, let alone in specialised jungle fighting. Many Indian battalions in particular were fresh recruits, some of which had actually been trained in desert warfare in expectation of service in the Middle East. Though there was plenty of artillery and anti-tank weapons, there was a lack of communications personnel and absolutely no armour. The defenders were under-strength, under-trained and under-equipped. The contrast to the Japanese invasion troops could not have been more stark. Under the command of Lieutenant General Yamashita Tomoyuki, the 25th Army would land 2 divisions in northern Malaya and drive a 3rd through Siam to the north. Its troops were trained for amphibious operations, well motorised and armoured, and had significant combat experience from fighting in China. The invasion would be supported by aircraft from 3rd Air Division as well as support from the Japanese Navy. Both sides thought that the battle for the air over northern Malaya would be crucial to the outcome of the campaign. To that end, the RAF built a variety of airfields in the north of the peninsula, designed to extend its range over the sea as far as possible. It was estimated by those in Malaya that a force of 566 aircraft would be needed for a successful defence. Those in London disagreed and forecast a need for only 336. So naturally, the amount actually in Malaya in December 1941 was 215 aircraft. The situation was even worse when you consider the aircraft the RAF did possess were mostly those considered obsolete or unsuitable for deployment in other theatres. The British fighter force in Malaya was made up of the US-built Buffalo fighter. It was slow, unmanoeuvrable and inferior to Japanese fighters on both land and sea. The aggressive positions the RAF had chosen for its airfields created a challenge for the army. It forced ground forces to hold a very advanced front line to protect them, even if this meant spreading themselves thinly across a wide area. The task of holding northern Malaya fell to the Indian Third Corps, with its 2 divisions and around 30,000 troops. The Australian 8th Infantry Division was stationed in Johore to guard against Japanese landings, while 2 more brigades were retained in Singapore itself. Of the Third Corps' 5 operational brigades, 4 were on the front line. The strongest unit, 11th Division, was positioned to defend Malaya's northern border with Siam. It had one of its 3 brigades in reserve to shore up any breaches. Meanwhile, the 9th Indian Division held the east coast, protecting airfields at Kota Bharu and Kuantan, but had only 2 brigades, so no reserves available. Neither division was in a position to support the other during an invasion. On December 4th, a Japanese convoy of 19 ships set off on its journey to Malaya. An Australian reconnaissance plane reported the armada south of Cape Cambodia on December 6th. As soon as this happened, the key decision for the senior British officers in Malaya became whether or not to launch Operation Matador. Matador was a plan for a preemptive strike into Thailand to seize key ports and prevent a Japanese invasion from coming ashore in the first place. Denying these ports to Japan would mean that enemy supply lines would have to run south all the way from Bangkok, massively hindering the invasion of Malaya. Originally conceived as a bold and decisive forward move, by December 1941 Matador had been slimmed down on account of the low number of troops available. Troops from 11th Indian Division would still advance to and secure Singora, but a Japanese landing at Patani would be permitted. 2 Indian battalions and a battery of Malay artillery would be ordered to hold the Japanese instead at an easily defensible position 30 miles inside Thailand, known as the Ledge. This smaller operation was termed Croco. Matador had been controversial, as a preemptive attack against a neutral nation like Thailand might make Britain look like the aggressor and make it harder to secure US support. It took until December 5th for authorization to trigger it to be given. The Commander-in-Chief Far East, Air Chief Marshal Robert Brooke Popham, would be responsible for triggering it, but could only do so if Japan attacked Allied possessions in the Far East, or to forestall a Japanese landing, or as a reply to a violation of any other part of Siamese territory. The wording of Brooke Popham's orders was such that in his view it effectively put him in charge of declaring war on Japan. So he wanted to be absolutely sure that a Japanese invasion really was imminent before ordering Matador's execution. So when information about Japanese convoys being sighted at sea reached Brooke Popham at 2 PM on December 6th, he held off until their intention was more certain. He didn't want to fall for a Japanese bluff. The Indian Third Corps, responsible for holding northern Malaya and carrying out Matador, was ordered to the highest degree of alert. This order found the commander of the Third Corps, General Sir Lewis Heath, in conference with General Arthur Percival, the overall commander of British ground forces in Malaya. Heath was deeply sceptical of Matador, viewing it as very unlikely to succeed considering the large distance that needed to be covered to Singora by British troops. Time would be of the essence, so Brooke Popham's hesitation to give the order made Matador even more difficult as the hours ticked by. The following day, weather over the sea was poor, and the Japanese fleet managed to avoid detection until 7 PM, a full 30 hours after the original sighting. By this time, the fleet was just 70 miles off Singora, steaming south at speed. It would be too late to launch Matador now with the expectation of taking the port, since the Japanese would beat them to Singora even if the British left immediately. General Percival advised Brooke Popham that Matador should now be cancelled, but the British Commander-in-Chief hesitated, not wanting to dispense with his only offensive option at this early stage. At 10:30 PM, the Indian Third Corps was ordered not to begin Matador, but to keep troops in position ready to launch it at any moment if ordered. According to the historian Peter Thompson, this was essentially the worst of both worlds. The 11th Division would now have to remain in their 4 positions near the Thai border, on alert in the pouring monsoon rains all night. And every minute spent stationary was another minute that wasn't being invested in strengthening defences further south at Jitra, which had been identified as the best position to hold a Japanese advance north of the airfield at Alor Star. The night dragged on, with British commanders nervously awaiting news of Japanese attacks, uncertain of the exact whereabouts of their opponents. At 1:45 in the morning, they got their answer. The first blows of the Malayan campaign were not struck in Thailand, but on the beaches of Kota Bharu on the northeastern coast of Malaya. The invasion began with a detachment under Major General Hiroshi Takumi from the Japanese 18th Division. It was a force of a little over 5,000 men, made up of the 56th Infantry Regiment with supporting batteries of anti-air guns and artillery. The invaders were quickly met by fierce resistance from 8th Indian Brigade under Brigadier Berthold Key. Dug in along a 10-mile stretch of beach was a single Indian battalion which inflicted heavy casualties amongst the first Japanese wave. However, they could not prevent a few landing craft from using the interconnected waterways of the marshy ground to get behind the front line, launching attacks from the rear that destabilised the Indian defence. A Japanese foothold was established by 1 AM. Less than 2 miles inland from the battle was the local RAF airfield, which from 2 AM launched air attacks with aircraft from No. 1 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force. Fierce anti-air fire lit up the sky as the pilots flying Lockheed Hudson bombers mounted successful raids on the transports carrying Takumi's men. 2 ships were damaged and a 3rd sunk. It was a welcome victory, but the fighting on the beach remained as intense as ever. After 4 hours of fighting by 3:45 AM, the defenders had mostly been displaced from the beach, which meant that the airfield was already under threat of capture, being so close to the coast. Recognising this and keen to repel the invasion on the beach, after dawn Brigadier Key ordered a counterattack with his reserves. 2 Indian battalions were brought up to attack the beachhead from north and south. Throughout the day, tough fighting raged on the coast, but slowly the Japanese began to get the upper hand, aided by large air attacks. The fighting got closer to the airfield, and when a rumour went round that the Japanese had broken through, somebody on the base, whose identity has remained a mystery, ordered without authorisation that a scorched earth policy go into action. Buildings and fuel dumps were set ablaze, and by the time Brigadier Key and the RAF commander, Wing Commander C.H. Noble, could confirm the rumour was false, it was too late. Additional Japanese reinforcements arrived on the beach from 7 PM, and the position at the coast became untenable, prompting a retreat to the town of Kota Bharu itself, a little way inland. By the end of the following day, 8th Brigade had pulled back further. A Japanese foothold in eastern Malaya had been achieved, for the loss of 320 troops killed and 528 wounded. Indian and British losses had been 68 killed, 360 wounded, and 37 missing. Following the loss of Kota Bharu, the commander of the Indian 3rd Corps, General Sir Lewis Heath, advocated for a much more substantial retreat, with 8th Brigade withdrawing inland to Kuala Lumpur. This would surrender a large part of northeastern Malaya to Japan, but it would enable the brigade to redeploy via the rail network to the west coast effectively. This plan was initially blocked by General Percival, who was horrified at the idea of surrendering such a large area to the Japanese so soon after the invasion. Soon though, a rapidly deteriorating situation in the west of Malaya would leave the British no choice. As the sun rose on the morning of December 8th, 1941, the Commander-in-Chief of the British Empire's armed forces in Malaya, Air Chief Marshal Sir Robert Brooke Popham, was under pressure. During the night, reports had come in of Imperial Japanese troops landing at Kota Bharu and in the Thai ports of Singora and Patani. Brooke Popham's closest fighting force, the Indian 11th Division, was forward deployed near the Thai border, waiting for the order to advance into Thailand to confront the Japanese as part of Operation Matador. But it had been a long night, and indeed a long couple of days since the Japanese invasion flotilla was first spotted. 2 days of indecision on whether to execute Matador or not meant there was now no hope of denying the use of Singora and Patani to the enemy. After taking more time to review fresh air reconnaissance, Brooke Popham made his decision. At 11 AM that morning, the commander of the Indian Third Corps, General Sir Lewis Heath, was informed that Operation Matador was cancelled. General Heath was furious at how long the order to cancel Matador had taken. His troops had stood waiting for orders all night, only to be told now they were to stand down and retreat south. British communications in Malaya were poor. It would take a further 2.5 hours, a full 12 hours after the landing of Japanese troops, for the 11th Division's commander, Major General David Murray Lyon, to receive his orders to retreat to fortifications at the town of Jitra. Precious time to dig in there had been lost, while the division had sat around waiting for Matador. One part of Matador that was to be carried out was known as Croco. This group had arguably the most important role to play at the start of the Japanese invasion anywhere in Malaya. It was tasked with occupying a crucial choke point inside Thailand known as the Ledge. If enemy forces bypassed this position and then went on to reach the road south of the town of Kro, then the British defences at Jitra would be encircled and the entire defence of northwestern Malaya unhinged. The Croco Advance began at the much delayed time of 3 PM on December 8th, 14 hours after Japanese troops had first landed. They got off to an immediately bad start. Not only did one of the 2 battalions assigned to the task fail to arrive in time, the other, 3rd Battalion, the 16th Punjab Regiment, ran into roadblocks manned by enterprising and hostile Thai policemen. As a result, the British force did not reach the town of Betong, barely 5 miles across the border, until the evening of December 9th, a full day and a half later. The following day ran more smoothly, but 5 miles from the ledge they were suddenly engaged by the vanguard of the Japanese 42nd Infantry Regiment. Japan had won the race to the ledge, and the 42nd Regiment quickly set about mauling the unfortunate Punjabis, driving them back across the border. To the north, things were not going much better. A small mechanised delaying force referred to as Leikol drove across the border on December 8th. They held a position 10 miles into Thailand at dusk on December 9th. When an armoured Japanese column arrived after dark, Leikol ambushed and halted it. But no sooner had the trucks and tanks stopped moving, Japanese troops leapt out and began an aggressive envelopment of the small force opposing them. Within minutes, the British force was swept into a retreat that would take them all the way to Jitra, destroying bridges as they went. It was the kind of bewildering, morale-sapping defeat which British forces would become all too familiar with over the next 2 months. The landings at Singora and Patani on December 8th had brought large parts of the Japanese 5th Division ashore. The aforementioned 42nd Regiment had pushed towards Kro, while from Singora the 11th and 41st Regiments headed south at speed. They were supported by a battalion of tanks and another of artillery. After the defeat of Leikol, there was nothing now between the Japanese and the British defences at Jitra. Around the same time as the Singora column was easily overcoming Leikol's attempts to stall them, the Indian 11th Division's troops were arriving to find their defences on the so-called Jitra line still mostly a building site. For the next couple of days, the troops would spend long hours digging out trenches and fortifications in the pouring rain, preparing for the oncoming storm. These 6th and 15th Indian Brigades were strung out along a 12-mile line to the coast, with the 28th Brigade in reserve to the south. To delay the Japanese and to give more time for defences to be prepared, a Punjabi battalion was sent to create a blocking position at the village of Changlan. This was 10 miles north of the main line, which centred around the town of Jitra and its key road and railway links. While the troops dug in, the RAF was making plans to abandon the airfield at Alor Star after heavy Japanese bombing of it on the morning of December 9th. General Murray Lyon had no idea this was happening, and the first he knew of it was when his own troops reported explosions and fire coming from the airfield. The ground staff had taken a scorched earth approach, despite the fact that troops from 11th Division were actually relying on stores being kept there. Nobody from the RAF had thought to inform Murray Lyon of what was going on, despite the fact that the whole point for 11th Division holding at Jitra was to protect the airfield. Early on the morning of December 10th, the reconnaissance regiment of the Japanese 5th Division, under Lieutenant Colonel Shizuo Seiki, contacted the forward elements of the 1st 14th Punjab Battalion north of Changlan. Seiki's mixed force of tanks, artillery and motorised infantry quickly drove the fighting into Changlan itself, where the Punjabis dug their heels in for the rest of the day. The 15th Brigade's commander, Brigadier K.A. Garrett, asked for reinforcements. The first of 3 available Gurkha battalions from the 28th Brigade was deployed to take a position at Asun, about halfway between Changlan and the Jitra line. After dawn the following day, Colonel Seiki renewed his attack, managing to dislodge his stubborn opponents in the afternoon. The Punjabis fell back towards Asun, but at about 4:30 the Japanese tanks caught up to and overran the battalion, which was in marching order and not expecting the enemy to have advanced so quickly. The 1st 14th Punjabs were scattered and took heavy losses. Around 200 men would rejoin the British by the next day, but the battalion was effectively eliminated from the battle. The tanks were halted outside Asun when an anti-tank rifle knocked out the leading vehicle, but a subsequent attempt to destroy the road bridge into the village failed when the detonators became too wet. As a result, Colonel Seiki could resume the attack at 6:30 and meet with great success. The inexperienced Gurkhas had not long been in position and could not cope with the tank's speed and firepower. The forward companies were quickly overrun and the battalion then annihilated, with more than 500 casualties taken and the loss of anti-tank and mountain artillery batteries. There were further equipment losses when a bridge over the Perlis Road in the west was destroyed too early, leaving 2 companies' worth of vehicles, anti-tank guns and artillery on the wrong side of it. Meanwhile, the Japanese advance carried on, with Seiki keen to press home his earlier successes. He had reached the Jitra line so quickly the anti-tank ditch wasn't finished. An initial probe ended with 2 tanks knocked out at about 8:30 before a more substantial attack was mounted after midnight on December 12th. The 1st Leicestershire Battalion was able to repel the attacks down the main road by dawn, but to the east Seiki's forces succeeded in driving a wedge between the Leicesters and the neighbouring Indian battalion, the 2nd 9th Jats. One of the casualties of the previous day's rout had been Brigadier Garrett, who was missing, so on the 12th the commander of 28th Brigade, Brigadier William Carpendale, took over temporarily. Believing the situation on the right flank to be more severe than it was, he reinforced it with 2 Gurkha battalions, using up the last reserves available at Jitra. In heavy fighting with artillery support, the British and Indian troops were able to contain the Japanese breakthrough, though an attempted counter-attack was repelled fairly easily by the Japanese. By this time, General Murray Lyon had decided that the Jitra line was now unviable, and his division should retreat. He requested permission to fall back to Gurun, a position about 30 miles south that was in many ways superior to Jitra geographically. But General Percival and the other senior officers refused. Just like with the landings at Kota Barut, they were unwilling to give up such large areas after only a short fight. In the afternoon, the fighting intensified. An additional Japanese infantry battalion arrived to reinforce Seiki, pressing home an attack focused on the most exposed company of the Jats. Several hours of close combat ensued, to the point where the company in question was on the verge of running completely out of ammunition, being left basically only with bayonets and grenades. In the late afternoon, things started to go downhill fast for the British. A huge gap opened up between the Leicesters and Jats, and the road, the division's only escape route south, was coming under artillery fire. At 7:30 PM, Murray Lyon again asked to be allowed to withdraw. Finally, 11th Division was granted permission to fall back at 9 PM, by which time it was dark. General Murray Lyon now had to try and evacuate his division while under fire, in the dark, down a single road, with poor communication between units. As you can imagine, it fast descended into chaos. Vehicles jammed the road, leading some units to set off cross-country. Others didn't get the order to retreat at all until it was too late. A retreat became a rout, and the last units finally managed to disengage at 4:30 in the morning. The dawn light exposed the full scale of the damage inflicted on 11th Division. The 15th Brigade had been reduced from 2,400 men to 600, less than a single battalion strength, and was essentially broken as a fighting force. In the 28th Brigade, the 2nd 1st Gurkha Battalion had been almost totally wiped out. 6th Brigade was more intact in manpower numbers, but this masked a huge loss of equipment during the chaotic retreat. In just 36 hours of fighting, the better part of an entire division had been driven from prepared positions by 2 Japanese battalions and a single company of tanks. It was a dreadful humiliation and laid bare the total failure of British decision-making in the days, weeks and months before the invasion. Mark Steele describes it as one of the British Army's most unlikely and complete defeats during the entire war. He argues that poor communication and training had allowed the division to be defeated piecemeal. The Japanese forces never had to fight a force larger than 2 battalions at once, so the British numerical superiority counted for little. The defeat at Jitra marked the end of the first phase of the Malayan campaign. Northern Malaya was lost, and the British command now had to desperately find a position they could hold in central Malaya. The first fallback position after Jitra was Gurun, which was arguably the finest natural defensive position in the whole of Malaya. It was a great natural defensive position, but there were no defences prepared there, so the troops had to dig in themselves. 2 days after they began this backbreaking work, the Japanese arrived, attacking straight down the road as they had done at Jitra. The initial assaults were repelled with heavy Japanese losses, but during the night a second attack drove a wedge all the way to the HQ of 6th Brigade, destroying it and forcing a retreat. Dislodged from their half-prepared positions, 11th Division fell back again, as the strategic situation for the British began to unravel. When the British and Indian troops regrouped at the Crian River, both the airfield at Butterworth and the island of Penang were hopelessly exposed to the Japanese. After a series of devastating air raids killed more than 5,000 civilians on Penang, the island was evacuated, though only European civilians were given the option of becoming refugees in Singapore. Penang was occupied by Japanese troops on December 19th, and Butterworth Air Base fell not long after that, further tightening Japan's grip on the air war that it had dominated since the invasion. General Murray Lyon's 11th Division was soon on the move south again, crossing the Perak River on December 17th with Japanese troops in pursuit. The division by this stage was not in a good way, with the 6th and 15th Brigades having to be merged into one and morale extremely low across the division. To try and change the division's fortunes, General Arthur Percival, the overall commander of British ground troops in Malaya, decided to make a leadership change. On December 23rd, he sacked Murray Lyon and gave command of the division to Brigadier Archibald Paris. Paris had been leading 12th Brigade, who had spent the last couple of weeks fighting rearguard actions to cover 11th Division's retreats. There were further changes at even more senior levels. On December 27th, Air Chief Marshal Robert Brooke Popham, the Commander-in-Chief Far East, was also removed, and his role was soon subsumed into a unified Allied command for the whole of Southeast Asia. The so-called American, British, Dutch, Australian Command, or ABDACOM, was led by General Archibald Wavell, who became on paper the ultimate commander of every Allied soldier, sailor and airman between Burma and Australia. In Malaya by Christmas, the Indian 11th Division was now intending to hold a position at Kampar. It was a decent spot with mountainous jungle terrain, meaning it could not easily be flanked from the east. The Japanese reached this position in strength on the last day of 1941 and found a much tougher Allied defence this time around. An attack on 2 Gurkha battalions north of the village of Saham was driven off, as the Gurkhas excelled themselves in fierce hand-to-hand combat against the Japanese attackers. It was a similar story the next day on the western side, as the 6th 15th Brigade resisted fiercely, supported by British artillery that held an excellent position on the mountainside to the east of Kampar. By the end of the day, all of the Allied positions were intact, but the Japanese had secured a foothold on the high ground, enabling them to press an attack on the merged battalion of Leicester's and East Surrey's on January 2nd. All through the day, against a superior force, the British and Indian battalions held out. Despite this though, their position was being undermined even as they fought. To the south of Kampar, the Japanese were landing the 4th Guards Regiment in the estuary of the Perak River and the 11th Infantry Regiment further south on the Burnham River. Brigadier Paris moved the 12th Brigade to face up to the landings, but they were outnumbered and pushed back. With the Kampar position now flanked and Allied troops in danger of attacks from their rear, the 11th Division withdrew once again over the night of January 3rd. In contrast to the earlier Battle of Jitra though, all 3 brigades were able to withdraw in good order without suffering serious damage. Overall, the Battle of Kampar was a much better showing by 11th Division, but the battle had still ended in further retreat. It was a similar story on the eastern coast of Malaya, which saw the Japanese 55th and 56th Regiments defeat the 22nd Indian Brigade at Kuantan on January 3rd, seizing the town and its airbase. The brigade was ordered to retreat inland, with a battalion commander winning a Victoria Cross for gallantry during a chaotic rearguard action after dark. On the same day as this was happening, in Singapore itself, reinforcements were beginning to arrive to bolster the defences, starting with the 45th Indian Brigade. They'd be joined by the 44th Indian Brigade and the British 18th Division in late January, but the flow was too slow to make an immediate difference at the front. With Allied troops in retreat across the board, on January 5th, General Percival now planned a steady withdrawal into Malaya's most southern state, Johor, to shorten the front line and to secure its flanks. The key hub of Kuala Lumpur would be surrendered without a fight, but the British hoped to maintain control of the airfields in the area until January 14th, so that a convoy carrying the reinforcing 54th Brigade could be covered from the air until it arrived in Singapore. After that, Percival planned to fall back to a line of resistance between Mersing and Muar that would be formed as the last stand on the Malayan Peninsula. Within a matter of days though, this plan all started to go a bit wrong. Keen to reach and secure Kuala Lumpur quickly, the commander of the Japanese forces, General Tomoyuki Yamashita, was pushing his forces south as quickly as possible, with little regard for their flanks or for logistics. Infantry on bicycles kept up alongside the armoured units. On January 5th, the vanguard of 5th Division reached Slim River, where a dug-in British force awaited them. Slim River was considered an excellent location to hold Japanese troops north of the airfields at Port Swettenham and Kuala Lumpur. Only a single road ran through the area, which was crisscrossed by rivers and thick jungle that the British thought would make outflanking impossible. 2 brigades were deployed in depth on the road, armed with anti-tank guns, mines and concrete blocks to hold up Japanese tanks. The Allied positions were well prepared, but the troops were tired and low on morale. They had withdrawn almost 180 miles in just 3 weeks, with little rest. On January 5th, the Japanese 42nd Regiment and a spearhead battalion of tanks attacked the forward positions of 12th Brigade, manned by a battalion of Hyderabad. Beaten back initially, they managed to then flank the defenders along the railway line to the west and forced them to retreat in the early hours of January 7th. The Punjab battalion immediately to the south was then able to knock out 4 Japanese tanks with mines, but their strongest position was then outflanked through the jungle and bypassed with relative ease. By 7 AM on January 7th, the Japanese spearhead had cut through the 2nd Argyll Battalion too, who would not have been expecting to have Japanese troops all over them so quickly. The lack of communications equipment and personnel in 11th Division was now making itself known. The rest of 12th Brigade did not know about the disaster unfolding at the front, let alone 28th Brigade further south. When demolition of a bridge at Trolac failed, the road south was completely open, and the Japanese tanks pressed on to exploit it, even as this meant pushing ahead without infantry support. At 7:30 AM they met the 5th Punjab Battalion on the road, which was marching north and could not get its anti-tank guns deployed before their opponents swept through, inflicting heavy casualties and scattering the survivors into the jungle. Without taking any kind of break, the 30 or so Japanese tanks now smashed into the western elements of 28th Brigade, which were taken totally by surprise, and 2 battalions of Gurkhas were swept aside in a matter of minutes. It was now a full-scale rout. Batteries of Allied artillery were simply ignored as the bridge over the Slim River itself was seized at 8:40 in the face of ineffective resistance from a troop of anti-air guns in the area. Still not satisfied, the tanks now turned south, pushing for 2 more miles until they came up to the 155th Field Artillery Regiment, which, despite being taken by surprise, was able to bring its 25-pounder guns to bear on the tanks, finally halting the advance. It had been a calamitous morning for the Allied forces. In a little over 6 hours, a single group of tanks had rampaged down a single road, shooting everything in sight with no adequate Allied response. As a result, 12th Brigade was effectively wiped out, and 28th Brigade lost 2/3 of its strength. More than 3,000 troops were taken prisoner, for Japanese casualties of just 150. Any hope of a slow and orderly retreat south vanished, and the chances of holding Johor long enough for strong reinforcements to arrive in Singapore reduced dramatically. After Slim River, the Indian 11th Division was shattered and had to be withdrawn from the fighting immediately. The Australian 8th Infantry Division was deployed to take over the front line, doing their best to hold the Japanese up alongside the newly arrived Indian 45th Brigade and British 53rd Brigades. Initial attacks against this newly named West Force under Lieutenant General Gordon Bennett were repulsed by the Aussies, but the strength of the 2 Japanese divisions now opposing them was too great. Further retreats were forced by January 20th, and any hope of holding on to the mainland was now disappearing. Rearguard actions were fought by West Force from January 24th as the Allies tried to get as many troops as possible evacuated to Singapore. When the 15th Indian Brigade was cut off at Rengit, it had to be evacuated by sea, and the 22nd Brigade was not so lucky when it was cut off in the jungle and forced to surrender. The last Allied unit crossed the Straits of Johor to Singapore Island on January 31st. The only road and rail bridge across the straits was then blown up, and the siege of Churchill's fortress Singapore began. As an island, Churchill believed Singapore made an excellent potential fortress to hold out against Japanese attack until help could arrive. He described the water surrounding it as a splendid moat. But to Churchill's consternation, he was informed on January 19, 1942, that very little defensive work had been done to fortify the northern shore of the island against attack from the mainland, either before the war or during it. Churchill was furious at this, fuming to the Chiefs of Staff that the fortress of Singapore was not entirely fortified against an attack from the northward. What is the use of having an island for a fortress if it is not to be made into a citadel? Churchill, though, should perhaps have known that Singapore was never intended to be a citadel or any other kind of fortress for that matter. The defences of the naval base were set up to defeat attacks from the sea, with defence on the landward side to be provided by troops fighting in Malaya, keeping enemy troops well to the north and out of artillery range of the naval base. Therefore, no land defences had ever been constructed on Singapore Island, but this did not stop Churchill from getting it into his head that Singapore was a fortress that could hold out against the odds. Precisely how he expected the naval base, which if we remember was the main reason for holding Singapore in the first place, to continue functioning while under artillery fire in the front line, was a mystery. Many of the commanders on the ground in Singapore thought there was little chance of holding the island for very long for this reason. Orders were orders though. Churchill was very clear that he wanted no thought of surrender until protracted fighting among the ruins of Singapore City. So it fell to Arthur Percival, General Officer commanding in Malaya, to organise the defence. Percival had an impressive sounding 85,000 Allied troops on the island, but around 15,000 of these were non-combat personnel. This left a multinational force of around 70,000 troops. There were 13 British battalions, mostly part of the newly arrived 18th Division, which was at full strength. 6 Australian battalions in the 8th Australian Infantry Division, which had been restored to full strength with the addition of 1,900 untrained replacements. 17 Indian battalions, which were the battered remainder of the Indian Third Corps. 13 of these were the product of merging battered units together earlier in the campaign, and only 1 was at full strength. There were also 2 regular Malay battalions and 3 battalions from the Straits Settlements Volunteer Force. It was a large but flawed force, with low morale from the weeks of retreat they had just been through. The Allies did have some things going for them though. For example, there was a large amount of artillery on the island, 9 artillery regiments as well as a variety of naval guns which, despite what you might have heard, were able to fire at targets on land. They were just stocked with armour-piercing rounds for anti-ship fire, not the high explosive rounds that would be good for artillery fire. The key decision for General Percival in early February was where to position his forces. In his opinion, the most likely area for Japanese landings was in the northeast, in the vicinity of the naval base. Both General Wavell, the Allied commander for Southeast Asia, and General Gordon Bennett, in command of the Australian troops, thought it more likely that the Japanese would cross in the northwest, where the strait was narrower, but Percival was adamant. The strongest Allied force, the fresh British 18th Division, would be positioned in the northeast, along with the remainder of the Indian 11th Division. The Australian 8th Division would take the western sector, along with the 44th and 15th Indian Brigades, leaving the 2 Malayan brigades and volunteer forces to secure the southern coast. The 12th Indian Brigade would be maintained as the only real reserve formation. Across the water, General Tomoyuki Yamashita was also weighing up his options. He correctly assessed that the British defences were stronger around the northeastern side of the island, so decided to land his forces on the western side. This was helped by the fact that 2 of his 3 divisions were already on the western side, since that was where they had advanced from, so organising the landings would be an easier logistical task. Yamashita planned for the first wave to attack the positions of the Australian 22nd Infantry Brigade. He would deploy the full force of the 18th and 5th Divisions, with 16 battalions hitting the beaches to overwhelm the 3 Australian battalions that would oppose them. Heavy reinforcement was then planned. The 1st Tank Regiment would land on the established beachhead, while the Imperial Guards Division would make a second landing on the northern shore of the island, supported by the 14th Tank Regiment. At just after 8:30 PM on February 8th, Australian sentries spotted landing craft emerging out of the dark. They opened fire, with Vickers machine guns and short-range mortar fire sinking and damaging a number of invasion barges before they could make the shoreline. Pre-arranged light signals for artillery support were fired into the air, but there were so many Japanese troops landing that the batteries struggled to keep up with demand. Invading troops arrived on the beach in force from 8:45, and the battle quickly became chaotic. The terrain on the coast here was a mix of beaches, tidal swamps and small streams, difficult to attack and even worse to defend, since permanent positions could not be maintained in areas that were underwater for half of each day. The Australian troops were very thinly spread, to the point that virtually no units could see any other friendly groups. This, combined with the destruction of Allied phone lines by Japanese artillery barrages, made a coordinated response close to impossible, despite the fierce resistance being put up by individual units. By midnight, despite a furious battle, the large numerical superiority of the Japanese had told, and they had pushed off the coast, getting themselves the foothold on Singapore they were after. Thousands of Japanese troops came ashore overnight, and the bulk of the 5th and 18th Divisions were ashore by the end of the next day. As a result, Percival was immediately forced to commit his only real reserve, the 12th Indian Brigade, to shore up the Australian positions. Despite the size of the Japanese force that had landed though, Percival did not move any units from the eastern side of the island, and the reinforcements he had moved west constituted only about 1,000 men. On February 9th, the Japanese pushed forwards in the northwest, capturing Tenga airfield and driving the Allied forces back to the Jurong line. This defensive perimeter had been hastily surveyed in late January and was the main planned defensive barrier on the western side of the island. If it held, then Percival would still have a viable front line to work with, albeit having lost part of the island. It may not come as a surprise to you that it not only didn't hold, but fell apart with remarkable speed. In the early hours of December 10th, the Imperial Guards Division under General Nishimura forced its way ashore, driving a wedge between the 27th Australian Brigade and its beleaguered western neighbours. The northern edge of the Jurong line was now outflanked, and without waiting for orders, the 12th Brigade moved back eastwards to prevent the Guards from smashing into their rear. At the same time, General Percival was circulating plans for a final fallback line around Singapore City itself, if such a retreat became necessary. But in a microcosm of Britain's struggles with communications throughout the Malayan campaign, when the 15th and 44th Brigade commanders got a hold of this plan, they assumed the orders were to go into action immediately. Unable to confirm over the telephone as all the lines were shot, the two brigades fell back off the Jurong line way too early, fatally compromising it. By the end of December 10th, the line was lost and there was no let-up from Yamashita. Both the 5th and 18th Divisions surged forwards while the Guards continued to land troops in the north. General Percival now desperately tried to regain some measure of control. He took a battalion from each brigade of the 18th Division and created an ad hoc group known as Tom Force to plug the gaps emerging in the north. He also planned a counterattack to retake the Jurong line, but the preparations for it were quickly overtaken by Japanese advances. Overnight on February 11th, Yamashita's 5th Division pushed from Tenga Airfield, scything through 12th Indian Brigade and an Australian battalion to take the key road junction at Bukit Timah, complete with its important supply depots. By 7:30, the Japanese 18th Division had cut straight through the Indian 15th Brigade, as the Allied line threatened to collapse. The Allied troops were now in disarray, but ammunition shortages on the Japanese side were beginning to make themselves felt. With no rail connections to the mainland, resupplying the attacking force was not easy. As a result, the pace of the attacks slowed, allowing Percival to concentrate a counterattack finally. 3 battalions were ordered to retake Bukit Timah, but this failed amid heavy defensive fire in the afternoon of February 11th. There was more bad news on the east of the island, as the growing strength of the Imperial Guards Division made itself felt, and Allied communications fell apart once again. Under pressure, the 27th Australian Brigade fell back unannounced, leaving the left flank of what was left of the Indian 11th Division horribly exposed. The 11th Division was forced to move south, meaning the naval base would now have to be abandoned. General Percival was forced to again dispatch another brigade-sized force from 18th Division to fill gaps between his other units, weakening his best formation once again. In the west of the fast-shrinking Allied perimeter, there was better news as the 22nd Brigade held out throughout the day against 2 Japanese regiments. The good news was fleeting though, as on February 12th the Japanese bounded forward to occupy the 3 reservoirs in the centre of Singapore Island. This was a significant moment as it cut off the water supply to Singapore City, putting a ticking clock on Allied resistance. At noon on February 12th, General Percival ordered the retreat back to the final perimeter around Singapore. His troops were battered. 22nd Australian Brigade was down to just 800 men, and morale was collapsing. The Japanese 18th Division ground forward in the southwest along the Holland Road and engaged the 1st Malayan Brigade. It was slow but steady progress until they reached the area of Pasir Panjang, where the Malayan 1st Battalion was dug in on an area of high ground known as Opium Hill. There, over the next 2 days, the Japanese tried repeatedly to take the hill, but were repulsed each time by a fearsome Malayan defence led in the front line by 2nd Lieutenant Adnan bin Saidi. When ammunition ran out, the defence carried on, with bayonets and eventually with bare hands. Lieutenant Adnan was wounded, but he remained alongside his men, resisting to the very end. After finally taking the hill, after 2 days and heavy casualties, the Japanese troops found Lieutenant Adnan badly wounded. Perhaps in some kind of retribution for the losses his leadership had cost them, the story goes that Adnan was strung up by his feet from a tree and bayoneted to death by the Japanese. Shortly after 1 PM on February 14th, the same detachments of troops arrived at Alexandra Hospital and set about committing an even greater atrocity. The hospital by this time was crammed with 900 wounded soldiers and had no defences. When a British lieutenant rushed outside to wave a white flag, he was bayoneted to death on the spot by the Japanese troops, 100 of which then rushed inside the hospital and rampaged throughout it. Dozens of patients and doctors were murdered, including 2 that were under anaesthetic on the operating table. The soldiers paused only to loot the corpses before marching the survivors out of the hospital and forcing them into a building a quarter of a mile away, where the doors and windows were nailed shut and they were left overnight without any water or ventilation. The following day, Japanese soldiers came back and murdered a further 100 of the remaining prisoners. These atrocities were carried out probably on the orders of Colonel Masanobu Tsuji. The historian Peter Thompson records, "The motive was to show Percival that an utterly mindless and totally ruthless force would be unleashed upon the citizens of Singapore if he persisted in ignoring Yamashita's demand to surrender." For Singapore, it was a precursor of atrocities to come in the weeks and months ahead. By this time, in the parts of the city still under British control, the atmosphere was starting to take on a distinctly last days of Rome feel, with looting and desertion becoming more commonplace, along with the systematic destruction in the city of anything the Japanese could find useful. Overnight on February 14th, all ships remaining in the harbour left for Java and Sumatra, carrying 3,000 refugees with them. Among the Allied generals, surrender was now very much on the table. By the end of February 14th, both the 5th and 18th Japanese divisions had reached the outskirts of Singapore and the water situation was becoming critical. On the morning of February 15th, Percival was informed the city had maybe 24 hours before the water system totally failed. He and all his commanders agreed that since there was no realistic prospect of recapturing the reservoirs to regain the water, there was now no alternative but to surrender. At 4:15 that day, Percival and his chief of staff travelled to meet with General Yamashita at Bukit Timah to agree to the Japanese demands for unconditional surrender. At 8:30 p.m, the Allied troops laid down their arms. Singapore had fallen. Singapore was Britain's worst defeat during the Second World War. In barely 2 months, the whole of Malaya and Singapore had been lost, 80,000 troops had surrendered, and Britain's entire strategy to contain the Empire of Japan had gone directly in the bin. It had been 2 months of successive bad decisions by British and Allied leaders. From Admiral Tom Phillips underestimating the power of aircraft and getting Repulse and Prince of Wales sunk, to the generals Wavell, Percival, Heath, Bennett and others, and their persistent underestimation of their opponents. The leadership right from the top was hesitant, indecisive and incapable. The story of the Allied defence of Malaya and Singapore is of an understrength, under-equipped and badly led force that was outmanoeuvred and outthought at every stage by an enemy they never took seriously enough. The numerous occasions of individual bravery by units and troops across Malaya was not enough to outweigh that. And of course we can't forget Churchill, whose insistence that Singapore could be held as a fortress had led to reinforcements being poured into a city arriving virtually only in time to surrender. He wrote simply after the war, "I ought to have known." Thank you for watching this series on the invasion and occupation of Malaya in 1941. If you want to learn more about it, including some battles I didn't include in the main video series, then please do check out this infographic poster I've created. It's got a whole bunch of information about the battles and the 2 sides involved and can be a permanent resource right there on your wall with anything you'd want to know about the Malayan campaign. You can pick it up over on Teespring and it would be great if you did, because every single poster sale or Patreon pledge really helps to continue making these videos on a permanent basis. Thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next video.